What would you do if one of the most famous men in the world demanded five-star treatment the moment he stepped onto your soil, and your government, instead of bowing their head, looked him straight in the eye and said no? That's the question echoing across Australia right now, and it's sparking a firestorm that stretches from Sydney all the way to Buckingham Palace. Because this isn't just another royal headline. This one carries the sting of embarrassment, the shadow of political tension, and a level of defiance that the monarchy hasn't faced in a long, long time. And at the center of it all stands Prince Harry, once the beloved royal rebel, now the man whose global standing seems to shift with every move he makes. So what exactly happened in Australia? Why did the government refuse a prince's request? And what does this mean for the Sussexes' highly anticipated return to the country? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Think about it. When a prince travels, certain assumptions take shape in the background. Luxury suites, heightened security, motorcades, diplomacy, ceremony, shiny floors, pressed linens. People bend over backwards to meet royal expectations, whether they agree with them or not. That's how it has always worked, or at least, how it used to work. But this time, when the request came through, something was different. Something in the tone, something in the timing, something in the politics. And instead of rolling out the red carpet, the Australian government quietly placed it back into storage and simply declined. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rude. But it was absolutely unmistakable. The answer was no. Now here's the question I want you to really consider. Why? Why would a government take the monumental step of rejecting a royal accommodation request, especially when the royals have visited Australia for generations? What changed? What snapped? What invisible line did Harry's team cross that made officials put their foot down? Because governments don't make decisions like this without thinking through the consequences. The monarchy may not legally run Australia, but symbolically, historically, culturally, those ties go deep. And a rejection like this isn't just paperwork, it's a statement. And here's where things get interesting. Because sources say the request wasn't small. It wasn't modest. It wasn't something quietly slipped into an itinerary. No, it was big, very big, bigger than what most world leaders request when visiting the country. A specific hotel, a specific suite, a specific floor sealed off exclusively for Harry and Meghan. Private entrances, security considerations, special permissions. A level of treatment that made some officials shift in their seats and ask a question that almost no one inside government circles ever asks. Is this necessary? And perhaps more importantly, is this appropriate right now? Because timing is everything. And the timing of this request collided perfectly with growing Republican sentiment, heated political debates about the monarchy, and rising frustrations over Harry and Meghan's public image. Not to mention lingering issues from the Sussexes' last Australian tour, the cracks, the tension, the behind-the-scenes stress that is only now coming back to the surface. You'd be surprised how many people in power have long memories, especially when it comes to major public events that involve the royal family. And Australia remembers that 2018 tour far differently than the glowing headlines suggested. So much so that some believe the seeds of this current conflict were planted years ago. Quietly, subtly, but firmly. But before we dive into all that, let's step into this story the way Australian officials did, with a sense of caution, tension, and curiosity. Imagine sitting in that meeting room, papers on the table, security experts on one side, political advisors on the other, travel coordination staff in the middle, and a request that made everyone lean back and take a long breath. Because in the past, these things moved like clockwork. A quick rubber stamp. A few logistical adjustments. Done. It was easy, predictable, routine. But something about this one didn't feel routine. Something about it was heavier. Maybe it was the global controversy swirling around Harry and Meghan. Maybe it was the unpredictable nature of modern royal appearances. Maybe it was because granting such a luxurious, high-profile accommodation could backfire politically at a time when Australians are questioning whether the monarchy even matters anymore. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something in the request that triggered deeper concerns. Concerns about security, concerns about status, concerns about liability, concerns about public reaction. And here's where the emotional tension begins to tighten. Australia isn't the same Australia it was even 10 years ago. The country is more outspoken, more politically conscious, more aware of how royal visits are funded and who benefits from them. People are asking tougher questions. They're challenging traditions. They're not afraid to call out entitlement when they see it. And this request, whether fair or not, landed in the middle of a national mood that was primed to reject anything resembling unnecessary privilege. But let me ask you this. Does one denied hotel request really have the power to change the tone of a royal visit? You might think the answer is no, but you would be wrong. Because according to multiple insiders, this single rejection, this single boundary, this single "not this time," triggered a chain reaction inside both the Australian government and within Harry's team that transformed a simple travel preparation into a full-blown diplomatic dance. One with miscommunication, pressure, frustration, missteps, and a few moments that some say bordered on disrespect. And the deeper you go, the stranger the story becomes. Because the refusal wasn't just about luxury. It wasn't just about politics. And it wasn't just about timing. But the refusal wasn't just about luxury. It wasn't just about politics. And it wasn't just about timing. It was about something deeper, something officials whispered about behind closed doors, something that made them look at the request not as a standard royal accommodation, but as a symbol of a bigger issue, an issue they could no longer ignore. And here's where the story tilts into territory no one expected, because choosing to reject Harry's demand wasn't just an operational decision. It was an emotional one, a cultural one, a political one, and the ripple effects of that single no began stretching into places that no one initially anticipated. So let's go deeper, because this is where the real twists begin. Ask yourself this. Why would a government, any government, risk displeasing a global figure, someone with influence, recognition, and a fan base that spans continents? It's not a small move. It's not a harmless decision. Governments typically avoid conflict with high-profile public figures, especially royals, because conflicts attract headlines, and headlines attract controversy. And controversy, especially royal controversy, spreads like wildfire. So what made this situation different? Why did Australia decide that rejecting Harry's request was worth the risk? Some insiders say it boiled down to a growing sense of frustration. Frustration about being taken for granted, frustration about being expected to automatically accommodate demands without discussion, frustration about the assumption that royal status alone was enough to override policy, protocol, and public interest. Others point to the political climate, which has shifted so dramatically that granting lavish privileges to any royal family member could backfire in real time. And then, there were those who quietly hinted at something more fragile, more sensitive, reputational fatigue. The exhausting cycle of Sussex-related controversies, the global debates, the constant media wars, the feeling that Australia, this time, didn't want to be pulled into the drama. Because let's be honest, everywhere Harry and Meghan go, the narrative follows. Supporters cheer, critics circle, commentators and tabloids sharpen their pens. And governments? They brace themselves. They prepare for the storm. They prepare for the spotlight. And some officials, according to those familiar with the matter, felt that Australia wasn't in a position, nor in the mood, to navigate another wave of royal turbulence. Not when domestic issues were already demanding attention. Not when political divisions were already widening. Not when the public's patience with monarchy-related expenses was already wearing thin. But even that wasn't the full story. Not even close. Because tucked beneath the public explanations, beneath the casual diplomatic language, beneath the polite phrasing of the refusal letter, was a second layer, a quieter, more complicated concern that Australia could not afford to mishandle. It centered on security. But not the kind of security you might imagine. Not just guards and protocols and private entrances. Something far more complex. Something that had been quietly brewing for months, possibly years. Something triggered by Harry's own evolving relationship with security services worldwide. Now picture this. A group of senior officials gathered in a secure office, reviewing documents, analyzing risks, cross-checking international obligations, and evaluating scenarios. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal. It was logistical, practical, and yet, the conclusions they reached carried emotional weight anyway. Australia suddenly found itself in a bind. If they granted Harry the five-star arrangement, with the full VIP perimeter, security perimeter, and expansive accommodations, then the government would inevitably become responsible for ensuring his protection inside that luxurious bubble. And that wasn't just expensive. It was politically sensitive. It was diplomatically dangerous. And it was legally complicated. Remember Harry's long, public battle with the British government over his own security status? Australia did. And the last thing anyone wanted was to become entangled in a similar conflict, especially one that could expose legal vulnerabilities or financial liabilities. Officials feared being caught in the crossfire between Harry's team and foreign authorities. They feared being blamed if anything went wrong. They feared the headlines, the backlash, the accountability. And so, the simplest path, the safest path, was to decline the luxury suite. And yet, as surprising as that may sound, even that wasn't the breaking point. No, the real pressure point came from something buried even deeper: the emotional complexity of Harry's public image. Australia has always been a country that values fairness, equality, humility, a sense of don't act like you're better than anyone else. That cultural thread runs deep, and while it has historically been set aside for royal visits, today's Australia is different. The cultural mood has shifted. People are quicker to question privilege. They're more alert to entitlement. And they're more vocal about saying, we don't need to bend the rules for anyone, not even a prince. So when Harry's request came through, officials didn't just see a hotel demand. They saw a symbolic test. A moment that could define how a modern Australia interacts with the monarchy. A decision that could either reinforce old hierarchies or signal that those hierarchies no longer apply. It wasn't personal. It wasn't hostile, but it was definitive. And in the end, they decided the symbolism mattered more than the suite. But before you think this was the end of the conflict, let me stop you. Because what came next pushed this already tense situation into a territory no one expected. Harry's team didn't simply accept the refusal and move on. They responded. And the response wasn't quiet. It wasn't neutral. It wasn't the kind of gentle acknowledgement that governments prefer. According to insiders, the reply from Harry's representatives created a second wave of tension, one that made some officials sit up straight, exchange glances, and say, we need to look into this more carefully. Why? What was said? What tone was used? What implications were hinted at? That's where the plot thickens. Because the real friction didn't start with the refusal. It started with what happened after. In that moment, one email, one phone call, one conversation, triggered a chain of actions that changed everything Australia thought this visit would be. And we haven't even scratched the surface yet. Because the truth is, Australia had already been cautious about allowing high-profile royal returns, not just because of politics, but because of something far more sensitive. Their own history of being drawn into controversies they didn't create. And Harry, whether fairly or unfairly, is a figure wrapped in controversy. He doesn't walk quietly through global affairs. He arrives with headlines. He arrives with security briefings. He arrives with questions that governments need answers to before they can even begin to plan a single night's stay. And while Australia has welcomed royals for decades, this moment was different, and officials felt it. You can almost imagine the tension in that room when one advisor finally said what everyone else was thinking. If we approve this, we're taking on risks we cannot control. And that's when the real turning point emerged. Not from emotion, not from politics, but from the cold, clinical world of risk assessment. Harry's team wanted certain protections, certain arrangements, certain guarantees. But those guarantees required Australia to adopt legal responsibilities they were not prepared to shoulder. The kind of responsibilities that could create precedents. The kind that could be interpreted as favoritism. The kind that could spark national debate. And suddenly, a simple hotel request looked like something else entirely, a political landmine. But here's the twist. The refusal didn't just create frustration on Harry's side. It created confusion. Because from his perspective, he wasn't asking for anything unusual. He wasn't inventing a new protocol. He was following the kind of arrangements that royals and high-profile public figures have used for years. And truly, from his vantage point, this wasn't entitlement. It was expectation, a pattern set long before he was born, a logistical necessity, a safety precaution, something that had always been available to him, whether as a working royal or not. But times change faster than expectations do, and the world Harry was once insulated within is no longer the world he walks in today. And that tension, the tension between expectation and reality, became the invisible thread pulling this entire situation apart. Australia wasn't rejecting Harry the person. They were rejecting what the request symbolized. They were rejecting the old model of royal privilege. They were rejecting the idea that they owed something simply because of tradition. And for a country that has spent decades wrestling with its identity, its history, and its relationship with the monarchy, this refusal was more than a decision. It was a declaration. But Harry's team didn't see it that way. At least, not at first. Because shortly after the refusal was delivered, according to insiders, a member of his staff reached out, not angrily, but firmly, seeking clarification, seeking justification, seeking a reconsideration. And that call changed everything. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't rude. But it carried a tone that made officials pause, a tone that made some feel pressured, a tone that hinted at the expectation that royalty, even non-working royalty, should naturally receive special treatment. Let me ask you something. How do you react when someone expects something from you that you no longer feel obligated to give? Do you comply to avoid tension, or do you set a boundary, even if it risks conflict? Australia chose the boundary. And that choice triggered a series of internal discussions that stretched far beyond hotel rooms. Suddenly, the government was reassessing the entire framework under which Harry and Meghan's visit would proceed. Security protocols, event locations, logistical flows, media interactions. Because once one part of the plan changes, everything else must realign. And this is where things get even more interesting. Because during that reassessment, during those tense hours and days, a detail surfaced. A detail tied to Harry's last visit to Australia. A detail that had been overlooked by the public but not forgotten by officials. Something that raised questions about whether repeating certain arrangements could create legal complications. Again, not personal, not punitive, just complicated. Something that made at least one official say, if we proceed, we need to be absolutely sure we're protected. And that single phrase, that single moment of caution, sent the entire planning process into a deeper, more scrutinized phase. But what was that detail? What was found? Why did it matter? And why did it contribute to the refusal of a hotel suite? That's where the mystery grows, because the explanations given publicly do not match the whispers we're hearing behind the scenes. And while officials won't confirm it, they also won't deny it. That alone speaks volumes. Something about that past visit, something small yet significant, played a role in shaping the present. And the Sussexes, according to insiders, had no idea this was even part of the discussion. They were blindsided by how quickly their request turned into a concern, and how quickly a concern turned into a refusal. And yet, this story isn't about blame. It's about perception. Because perception, especially on the international stage, is everything. Australia perceived the request as too grand, too complicated, too politically risky. Harry perceived the refusal as unexpected, maybe even disrespectful, maybe even symbolic of a much larger shift. And that shift, whether he realized it or not, was already unfolding. Because while this story centers on a hotel suite, the truth is it represents something much bigger, something deeper, something that reaches into the very heart of Harry's evolving place in the world. Because once upon a time, his presence alone could command logistical deference. Today he stands in an unusual position, no longer a working royal, yet still globally recognized. No longer protected by the royal machinery, yet still carrying the royal name. No longer within the institution, yet still shaped by its expectations. And Australia realized something that few governments have had to confront so directly. What do you do with a royal who is both inside and outside the system? A royal who wants security like a statesman, privacy like a celebrity, influence like a leader, and independence like an activist? Those categories don't neatly align. And this hotel request forced Australia to choose which version of Harry they were willing to accommodate. In the end, they chose none. And that choice set the stage for the tension that now surrounds the Sussexes' upcoming visit. But here's the most surprising part. The refusal wasn't meant to embarrass Harry. It wasn't meant to send a message. It wasn't meant to make headlines. It was made quietly, internally, privately. The Australian government did not expect it to leak. They certainly didn't expect it to explode across international media. And when it did, officials found themselves caught in an entirely different storm, one they never intended to start. And that brings us to the question burning through this entire story. If the refusal wasn't meant to go public, who leaked it? And more importantly, why? Because this leak didn't happen by accident. And the answer behind that leak will take us into the next phase of this story, one filled with tension, motives, suspicion, and a revelation that ties directly back to Harry and Meghan's past. But before we dive into that, there's one more layer you need to understand. One more piece of context without which the rest of this story won't make sense. One more connection between the past and the present that sets the tone for everything that follows. And that connection is something Australia has been holding on to for years. Something from the 2018 tour. Something that no one expected would resurface now. Something that will change the way you understand everything about this refusal. Something from the 2018 tour. Something Australia never forgot. Something that officials quietly filed away, thinking it would never matter again. Until now, when Harry's five-star request forced them to reconsider everything they once looked past. Because this story doesn't start with the hotel demand. It starts years earlier, in moments the public barely noticed, moments that quietly shifted how Australian officials viewed Harry and Meghan, not as symbols, not as celebrities, but as logistical realities. And once those memories resurfaced, the path to refusal became clearer than anyone outside government circles could possibly imagine. Imagine being an official during that 2018 royal tour. It was one of the biggest royal moments in modern Australian history. Crowds filled streets. Flags waved. Cameras flashed. The Sussexes, newly married and newly iconic, were celebrated as if they were the centerpiece of a global fairy tale. Everything looked perfect on the surface. Everything sparkled. But behind that surface, behind the dazzling smiles and viral clips, the tour was chaos. Staff exhaustion. Scheduling strain. Constant changes. Last-minute requests. Security confusion. Moments that required improvisation at levels that government planners still talk about with a sigh. And while the public never saw that backstage turbulence, the officials responsible for managing it absolutely did. They lived it. And they remembered it. So when word reached them that Harry wanted top-tier, government-supported luxury accommodations upon his return, some of those officials looked at each other and quietly thought, not again. Not another round of unpredictable changes. Not another round of rushed security adjustments. Not another round of unexplained schedule tweaks that put staff under pressure. Not another round of trying to please a couple whose behind-the-scenes demands were, according to multiple insider accounts, far more taxing than the smiling public image suggested. And in that quiet recollection, a shift happened. A mental shift. A political shift. A logistical one. The memory of that tour, stressful and still unresolved in many minds, lingered like a shadow over the new request. But here's where the story deepens further. This isn't just about memory. It's about evolution. In 2018, Harry and Meghan were working royals. The world bent around them. Government support was standard. Accommodations were built into the entire structure of the tour. But now, in 2025, things are different. They are no longer working royals. They are private citizens. Influential, yes. Recognizable, yes. But not representatives of the crown. And Australian officials could not justify offering royal-level treatment to people who, in the strictest constitutional sense, no longer operate in that capacity. This is where contradiction enters the picture, a contradiction loaded with emotion, tension, and irony. Because Harry holds a unique status unlike anyone else on the planet. He is both royal and not. Both protected and not. Both symbolic and independent. Both entitled to certain privileges and disqualified from others. No other figure straddles these lines so awkwardly. And that awkwardness is exactly what Australia was forced to confront. They had to decide which version of Harry they were dealing with. The prince? The celebrity? The activist? The former working royal? The man fighting with governments over security rights? Or the global figure who still draws crowds, but no longer represents an institution? Each version required a different level of accommodation. Each version required a different type of permission. And in this case, None of the versions aligned cleanly with what Harry's team was asking for. It wasn't malice. It wasn't judgment. It wasn't even political rebellion. It was simply a reality that clashed with an expectation. And that clash created a ripple effect that eventually led to the quiet but firm rejection that is now dominating global headlines. But let's zoom in on that key moment. The moment when the Australian government reviewed the request and realized they had to say no. Picture the room. Picture the tension. A stack of documents. A list of logistical requirements. A projected security cost. A forecast of public reaction. And then the question that tipped the entire situation toward refusal. Is this in the national interest? Silence. Maybe a few glances. Maybe a sigh. And then a sober, unavoidable answer. No, it isn't. The answer wasn't hostile. It wasn't angry. It wasn't punitive. It was simply the only answer that made sense in the context of the current political climate. Because offering VIP treatment to Harry during a period of rising Republican sentiment would have provoked backlash. The headlines would have been immediate and brutal. Government funds royal luxury during economic pressure. Special treatment for Sussexes sparks outrage. Why are we paying for this? And in Australia, where political missteps can create weeks of controversy, no one wanted to walk into that storm. And yet, refusing the request came with its own set of risks. Royals, especially Harry, come with global attention. A refusal could be interpreted as disrespect. It could risk diplomatic tension. It could trigger media speculation. But after weighing everything, the political climate, the logistics, the memory of the 2018 tour, the complications around Harry's security status, the financial implications, the symbolism, officials chose the path with the least long-term fallout. But the government never intended the decision to go public. They planned for the refusal to remain discreet, procedural, unremarkable. A small internal matter. A closed-door decision no one outside the necessary circles would ever hear about. Maybe a polite email. Maybe a brief phone call. Nothing more. And had the world never learned about it, this entire story would never exist. But someone wanted the world to know. Someone wanted this decision exposed. Someone leaked it, and they leaked it strategically, deliberately, precisely at the moment when it would cause the greatest impact. Because think about the timing. The story broke just as discussions were underway about a possible Sussex return to the region. Just as the political conversation around the monarchy was heating up again. Just as public interest in Harry was spiking due to unrelated controversies. And just as several organizations were considering whether to partner with the Sussexes for future speaking engagements or charitable events. Convenient? Coincidence? Hardly. Leaks are rarely random. They happen because someone wants something. Influence. Pressure, narrative control, revenge, or sometimes political advantage. The question isn't whether the leak was intentional. Of course it was. The real question is, who benefited from this story going public? And that's where the next twist emerges, because according to early whispers, the source of the leak wasn't who anyone expected. It wasn't an angry government worker. It wasn't a rogue hotel employee. It wasn't a political opponent. It was someone with a connection to the Sussex world. Someone who stood to gain from creating distance, tension, and public narrative heat. One insider described the leak not as sabotage, but as a preemptive strike. A way of shaping the story before Harry and Meghan arrived in Australia. A way of framing the tone. A way of influencing how the visit is perceived. Because if the public sees the Sussexes as demanding, the institutions they interact with gain leverage. And if the public sees Australia as firm but fair, the government strengthens its position. And if someone behind the scenes wants to influence either of those outcomes, leaking the refusal is an effective tactic. But again, the leak isn't the story. The leak is the spark. The real story is why the refusal happened in the first place, and why it matters now more than it ever would have in the past. And that answer lies in a simple truth that underpins this entire situation. Australia is no longer willing to play by the old rules. The monarchy's influence is fading. Public sentiment is shifting. Political priorities are evolving. And old expectations, once unquestioned, are now being challenged. Harry's request collided with a new reality. A reality in which royal privilege does not guarantee royal treatment. A reality in which governments set boundaries. A reality in which entitlement is scrutinized. A reality in which Harry's name, once a shield of protection and privilege, now carries as much controversy as celebration. And this refusal, this denial of a five-star suite, this moment of national certainty, signals something deeper happening behind the scenes, a transformation in how the world interacts with royalty. A transformation driven by politics, culture, identity, and generational change. Harry just happened to be the figure who experienced it most publicly. And now, with the refusal leaked, with tensions rising, with questions swirling, and with Australia quietly preparing for the Sussexes' eventual arrival, a new phase of the story begins. Because the next question isn't what Australia did. It's what Harry will do. And that's where Chapter 1 begins. Inside the demand that started it all, the request that triggered a diplomatic shift, and the behind-the-scenes details that no one has fully uncovered. Yet, what happens when a prince makes a request so specific, so finely tailored, so meticulously detailed that even seasoned government officials pause and ask, is this really what they want? That was the question hovering in the air the moment Prince Harry's accommodation request reached the desks of Australian planners. And it wasn't the kind of request written casually in an email or mumbled over a quick call. It came with formality, with structure, with a tone that signaled expectation rather than negotiation. And the moment it was reviewed, something about it hit differently, because it wasn't just the typical royal ask. It was elevated, customized, and wrapped in layers of security, privacy, and exclusivity that officials rarely see, even with high-profile heads of state. You can almost imagine the faces in that office. One set of eyes widening slightly, another pair narrowing. A third person leaning back in their chair, exhaling as they scanned the page again to make sure they hadn't misread anything. Because the list wasn't short. It wasn't vague. It clearly reflected a mindset shaped by years of royal living. Private entrances. Entire floors blocked off. Reinforced window security. Staff-only elevator access. A 24/7 security operations room adjacent to the suite. A private chef on standby. Rooms for additional personnel. And that was just the beginning. So the question arises, was this entitlement? Or was this simply the reality of being one of the most recognizable men in the world? Let's not forget who Harry is. A man who, for nearly 4 decades, lived inside a structure where logistics bent around him, where every door opened, where every accommodation was guaranteed, where people built entire security plans around his movement, where the world adjusted itself to his presence, not the other way around. So when his team made its request, it likely came from muscle memory. This wasn't Harry asking for luxury in the sense the public imagines. It wasn't vanity. It wasn't indulgence. In his mind, it was necessity, standard protocol, life preservation. And, if you think about it from that angle, it makes sense. When you're the son of a king, when you've grown up under threat, when your safety has been risk-assessed since childhood, your normal isn't normal. Your minimum requirement is an average person's maximum extravagance. But here's the twist that Australia had to grapple with. Harry is no longer operating inside the same institution he once did. He stepped back. He left the traditional structures behind. And in doing so, he changed the very assumptions under which governments treat him. That doesn't mean he isn't protected. It doesn't mean he isn't respected. But it does mean that every request now sits under a different lens. And unfortunately for Harry's team, the lens Australia used to examine this particular request was sharper, clearer, and less forgiving than anything the prince had encountered in years. Still, before we judge, let's explore what he allegedly asked for in detail. Because understanding the request itself is key to understanding the emotional storm that followed. According to insiders familiar with the documents, the request was centered around one of Sydney's most prestigious hotels, a property known for discreet celebrity accommodations, impeccable privacy layers, and a history of hosting royalty. Harry was reportedly offered a selection of high-end suites, but his team declined them, insisting on something more controlled. They wanted the presidential suite, one of the most expensive residential spaces in the entire country. Reserved exclusively for the couple, not just the room, but the entire wing surrounding it. That meant no guests on the same floor, no shared hallways, no neighboring rooms, no accidental encounters. An entire section of the hotel sealed, secured, and redesigned to meet Sussex standards. That's already a huge logistical shift for any hotel. But the request went further. Harry's team allegedly wanted a controlled private entrance. Not just the staff entrance, but a customized access point shielded from public view. They wanted a blackout-level privacy perimeter. No cameras, no hotel staff with phones, no chance of photographs or videos being taken. They wanted personal staff vetted by government security. They wanted a room configured for crisis communication. They wanted a special window glazing assessment to prevent long-lens photography. They wanted secure transport directly from the hotel's underground facility. And every one of these requests, individually, is understandable. But together, they form a profile normally reserved for either a head of state or someone under credible threat. And Harry is indeed under constant scrutiny. His security troubles have been well documented. He's faced unimaginable levels of risk since birth. And given that Australia's own celebrity culture is intense, it makes sense why his team would aim high. But to the Australian government, this wasn't just a request for security. It was a request for resources, political capital, staff hours, national-level coordination. And the government had to ask, are we obligated to meet all this? Yet here's the contradiction that makes this moment so complicated. Australia has previously accommodated high-level royals with far more elaborate preparations. They've provided security layers thicker than metropolitan police departments. They've secured entire districts, not just hotel floors. They've adjusted traffic routes and set up emergency protocols. They've spent millions, and they did it without blinking. So why does Harry's request feel so different? Why did this one push officials toward refusal? Because unlike past visits, this request came without the traditional scaffolding of an official royal tour. Harry isn't representing the crown. He isn't doing engagements on behalf of the monarchy. He isn't acting as an official emissary. And without that institutional backing, special accommodations fall into a murky gray zone. Who pays for what? Who covers security? Who takes responsibility? Who sets the rules? Who holds liability? Who handles media fallout? In an era where taxpayers scrutinize every dollar spent, especially on VIP accommodations, approving a request like this requires a justification that extends beyond he's a royal. But Harry's team didn't see the tension. They pushed forward energetically, perhaps believing Australia would, as it always had in the past, adapt. They outlined the preferred chefs, dietary needs, and the setup of a private wellness room for the couple. They specified meeting spaces. They included details about the temperature settings that needed to be consistent for the duration of the stay. They highlighted privacy buffers. And while none of this was inherently problematic, the accumulation created a picture of a visit that felt less like a routine arrival and more like the planning for an international summit. Ask yourself this. Do you think Harry himself reviewed every line of that request? Probably not. Most likely, his team created it based on precedent, based on past expectations, based on maintaining consistency. But behind the scenes, the emotional interpretation of this request was far different. To many Australian officials, it felt like a throwback to an era they were no longer willing to imitate. It felt like a nod to royal hierarchy at a time when reverence has been replaced by skepticism. And it raised a quiet but important question. Is this request reflective of modern Australia's values? And that's when the emotional beats begin to shift, because this isn't just a logistical story. It's a cultural one. Australia is a country that prides itself on egalitarianism, on straight talking, on rejecting pretentiousness, on valuing ease over ceremony. So when they read a request that felt excessively formal, structured, and tiered, it didn't just raise eyebrows. It raised issues. It didn't just feel heavy. It felt out of touch. And not because Harry is out of touch, but because the world he once moved through effortlessly doesn't exist in the same way anymore. But let's flip the lens. Because the irony in all this is that Harry, of all the royals, has worked the hardest to step away from elitism. He moved countries, built a new career, rejected titles, embraced independence, advocated for mental health accessibility, spoke candidly about the pressures of privilege. And yet, when this request surfaced, it painted a completely different picture of him, one that might not be accurate, but one that is now shaping global perception. This disconnect forms the heart of the contradiction. Harry's personal evolution versus the institutional expectations he still carries, even unintentionally. It's the collision between who he wants to be and what the world assumes he still is. And Australia wasn't responding to Harry the man. They were responding to Harry the symbol of a monarchy they no longer fully embrace, the symbol of privilege they are actively questioning, the symbol of old world hierarchy at a time when new world values are taking root. And it's exactly that clash between the old world and the new that pushed this accommodation request from questionable to unacceptable. But the story doesn't end here. Because while the request itself was dramatic enough to trigger national discussion, the reaction inside Australia's government is where the real twist begins. Because instead of dismissing the request as unrealistic or pushing it through quietly, officials began to re-examine everything connected to Harry's planned visit. They pulled old files. They reviewed past experiences. They revisited notes from 2018. They questioned security responsibilities. They reviewed protocol. And they discovered something that changed the tone of the conversation entirely. A detail, a record, a piece of information that forced them to reevaluate not just the accommodation request, but the entire framework surrounding Harry's return. And that discovery set the stage for the internal decision that now dominates global headlines. Because officials weren't just rejecting a hotel room. They were responding to something far more sensitive. Something that almost no one outside that room knows about. Something that will change the way you view Australia's refusal and Harry's entire visit. What does it take for a modern government, one accustomed to diplomacy, protocol, and the delicate art of keeping high-profile guests comfortable, to look at a royal request and quietly decide, we can't do this? That's the question that hovered like a storm cloud the moment Prince Harry's accommodation file reached the inner circle of Australia's Travel Coordination Office. Because this wasn't the kind of request they could skim casually. This wasn't the kind of document that could be approved with a perfunctory signature. This one required debate, caution, reflection, and ultimately, a decision that would shift the tone of an entire royal return. Imagine the scene. A conference room with neutral walls, a long table, and folders laid out in front of several key people, travel planners, risk analysts, political aides, and senior officials who have been through everything from presidential visits to emergency diplomatic situations. They've seen complicated. They've seen demanding. They've seen overwhelming. But according to those familiar with the meeting, there was something different about this one. Something that made even the most experienced among them lean in attention, sensing that this wasn't just paperwork, it was a pressure point. The meeting began the way bureaucratic meetings always do, with someone clearing their throat, tapping a pen, and giving the room a neutral summary of the request. The words were professional. The tone was calm. But as the details unfolded, suite requirements, security perimeters, privacy demands, logistical constraints, the atmosphere shifted. You could feel it. A subtle tightening. A mental recalibration. People began exchanging glances, not hostile, not mocking, but surprised. Not because the request was unreasonable in the royal world, but because the royal world had changed, and Australia's role in it had changed too. One official, according to a source, muttered under their breath, "This is going to be a problem." Not a dramatic explosion, not a confrontational statement. Just a simple, honest acknowledgement of what everyone was starting to realize. That granting this request would place the government in a politically sensitive position during a year where every expense, every decision, every hint of privilege was being scrutinized by the public with unrelenting intensity. Because here's the truth. Australia is in a different political chapter. The monarchy's influence has been steadily declining. Debates over republicanism, indigenous voice, national identity, and cultural independence have taken center stage. And in this climate, offering lavish, taxpayer-assisted accommodations to a prince, especially one who is no longer representing the monarch officially, was a decision that could ignite a wave of headlines the government simply couldn't afford. So as the meeting progressed, the discussion shifted from logistics to risk, and that's where the pressure intensified. Risk assessment isn't just about safety. It's about optics, liability, public reaction, financial exposure. And according to insiders, every one of those categories lit up red. One advisor reportedly asked the room, "What is the justification? If the press gets wind of this, what do we say?" Silence. No one had a clean answer. Another official raised a larger concern. If they agreed to Harry's special accommodations, they would set a precedent for future non-working royals. Today, Harry. Tomorrow, someone else. Suddenly, every private royal visit would require the same treatment. And once a government sets that standard, rolling it back becomes nearly impossible. But the turning point, the moment things shifted from skepticism to certainty, came from the security team. They had been reviewing the request with meticulous detail, cross-checking each line with Australian security policy, international guidelines, liability constraints, and recent rulings involving Harry in the United Kingdom. And when they finished, their conclusion struck the room with the weight of a verdict. If we approve this, we take on full responsibility for his protection. That includes the perimeter, the staff, the access points, and every contingency plan. But Prince Harry is currently engaged in legal disputes over his security status abroad. That puts us in a complicated position. If something goes wrong, we carry the legal consequences. The room went still. This was the part no one wanted to confront. The part that felt like a trap. Because if Australia provided top-tier, state-supported security arrangements, Harry's legal team could later point to it as proof that governments worldwide believe he needs state-level protection. And that would contradict what Harry's own native government has argued in court. It could drag Australia into an international security controversy they had absolutely no interest in joining. But there was more, something kept even quieter. Someone in the room had pulled up an internal note from 2018. A footnote from the previous tour. A detail about security coordination that had gone wrong. Not disastrously wrong, but wrong enough that Australia quietly vowed never to repeat it. A scheduling change made by the Sussex team. A last-minute location switch that forced the local police into a scramble. Something small on the surface, but massive in the machinery of VIP security. It didn't make headlines, but it left a mark on the people responsible for managing it. And that detail resurfaced at the worst possible moment. It shifted the conversation decisively. One official, according to a government source, leaned forward and said the sentence that changed everything. If we couldn't control the environment last time, why would we take on even greater responsibility now? The question hit the table like a gavel. Because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't accusatory. It was purely practical. And practicality is the one force that can override prestige. Still, before making a final call, the officials tried exploring alternatives. Could they offer a different hotel? Could they adjust the Windsor-level requests into something more appropriate for a private visit? Could they split costs? Could they reframe the reasoning? But each option led to the same brick wall. The request wasn't compatible with the political climate, the security frameworks, or the public sentiment. And then, as if the universe wanted to deliver the final push, news broke that week of growing public frustration over government spending on VIPs. Headlines criticizing travel budgets. Social media exploding over the perceived privilege of political and social elites. The timing couldn't have been worse. Approving Harry's request would have detonated in the press. That's when the decision became inevitable. A senior official summed it up in one simple, devastating line. We can't do it. Not now. There was no anger in the room. No drama. Just a collective understanding that refusing was, ironically, the safest, most respectful path forward. So they prepared the response. A carefully worded decline. Polite. Diplomatic. Professional. Something that expressed appreciation for the Sussexes' interest in visiting, but made clear that the requested arrangements fell outside the scope of what the government could support. But here's where the emotional tension spikes. They expected Harry's team to understand. They expected the request to be amended. They expected the matter to end quietly. It didn't. Because the moment Harry's team received the refusal, everything changed. The mood shifted. The tone shifted. The dynamic shifted. And insiders say what happened next caught Australia completely off guard. A call came in, a follow-up from someone in Harry's circle. Not confrontational, but firm. Very firm. The kind of tone that makes government officials straighten their posture. The caller reportedly pushed for clarification. Asked whether the decision was final. Asked whether exceptions could be made given Harry's global profile. Asked whether the government understood the implications of not accommodating him at this level. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't disrespectful. But it carried weight, royal weight. The kind of weight that historically causes governments to bend. But Australia didn't bend. After the call ended, the officials reconvened. And instead of reconsidering, they doubled down. The call didn't soften the refusal, it solidified it. Because the tone suggested expectation. And expectation is exactly what Australia was rejecting. And then something unexpected happened. The refusal sparked internal discussions that went beyond logistics. It triggered a broader political conversation. A debate about the future. A debate about the monarchy. A debate about symbolism versus sovereignty. And while none of that was Harry's fault, he became the catalyst. But the most shocking part wasn't the decision itself. It wasn't the reasoning. It wasn't even the follow-up call. It was what came next. The leak. A leak that none of the officials authorized. A leak with perfect timing. A leak that turned a private decision into international drama. And the strangest part? The leak didn't come from the Australian government. Meaning someone else, someone with access, someone connected to the Sussex orbit or the hotel planning or third-party logistics, wanted this story out there. Why? That's where the next chapter begins. Because the answer to who leaked this story isn't obvious. It's layered, it's strategic, and it ties directly into the deeper political climate Australia is navigating. And unraveling that mystery reveals a truth far bigger than a hotel suite. What if the refusal of a 5-star hotel suite wasn't really about the hotel at all? What if it was the visible tip of a much deeper shift? One that has been quietly reshaping Australia's identity, its relationship with the monarchy, and its political priorities? Because the moment the leak hit the headlines, analysts didn't just ask, why did Australia say no? They asked a far bigger, more revealing question. Why did this refusal happen now? And the answer takes us into the complex, emotionally charged political climate that Harry's request accidentally collided with. A climate shaped by history, national pride, frustration, cultural evolution, and one unmistakable truth. Australia is changing. So let's begin with the reality that officials inside Parliament House understood instantly, even before the public did. Australia is in the middle of a political and cultural restructuring unlike anything the country has experienced in decades. And if you try to understand this moment without understanding that transformation, you miss the entire emotional weight behind the refusal. Because Harry's request didn't fall onto neutral ground. It didn't land in a country that still feels unquestioning loyalty toward the monarchy. It landed in a place where many Australians are now asking themselves, openly and unapologetically, do we even need a royal family anymore? Think about that for a second. For most of modern history, the monarchy has been symbolic, ceremonial, a distant but familiar anchor, the Queen on currency, a portrait in a government office, a figurehead who embodied stability. But now, with King Charles on the throne, with Prince William preparing for leadership, with the Sussexes redefining what it means to be royal in a world of independence and media storms, Australia is re-evaluating its role in that tradition. And the debates aren't quiet. They're active, intense, charged. The refusal of Harry's request wasn't an isolated event. It was a spark that landed on dry political brush. In recent years, conversations about becoming a republic have surged with more urgency. Politicians on both sides of the aisle have spoken publicly about reassessing Australia's connection to the monarchy. Indigenous leaders have questioned the symbolism of royal authority. Younger Australians, especially, have voiced frustration about outdated structures and colonial legacies. The emotional center of the country is shifting, and it's shifting toward autonomy, identity, and independence. Now imagine inserting a royal demand, especially one perceived as extravagant, into that atmosphere. Do you think it would land gently? Or do you think it would ignite something? Of course it ignited something. But the deeper question is why people felt so strongly about it. Why did the refusal of a luxury suite generate such powerful reactions across newspapers, talk shows, social media, and political commentary? Why did it feel like more than just a hotel story? Because it symbolized a collision between past and present, between tradition and modern identity, between inherited status and earned sovereignty, between the royal world Harry came from and the grounded, egalitarian values Australia embraces. And that collision didn't begin with Harry. It began long before. Let's rewind just a bit. The last decade has seen major shifts in Australian cultural and political discussions. Controversies around colonial history, the national conversation about indigenous recognition, educational reform, changes in media consumption, the rise of political independence and minor parties, economic pressures, housing crises, generational divides. All of these realities have created a population far more skeptical of privilege and far more vocal about fairness. Now add to that the global debates around Harry and Meghan, their interviews, their claims, their brand, their critics, their supporters. Australia has watched all of it, from a distance, yes, but with deep interest and intense scrutiny. And by the time this travel request reached Canberra, people had opinions. Strong ones. And those opinions weren't always flattering. Some saw Harry as a hero. Some saw him as a rebel. Some saw him as a victim. Some saw him as entitled. And some saw him as a symbol of a monarchy that simply no longer reflects who they want to be. So when the story leaked, it fed directly into the existing tension. Suddenly, everything became amplified. What might have been a simple administrative decision transformed into a national debate about identity and values. People asked, why should we upgrade royalty over our own? Others asked, why should a private individual receive government-level accommodations? And others asked, why are we still treating royals like they are above the rest of us? And what was the government supposed to do? Ignore the growing sentiment? Pretend the world hadn't changed? Pretend Australia hadn't changed? No. They did what governments do when political pressure meets logistical reality. They acted cautiously. They chose the safest political path. They placed public perception above royal tradition. They reinforced sovereignty. They reinforced independence. And whether people agree or disagree, one thing is certain. The refusal reflected the mood of the country. But that's not the only layer. There's another piece of this puzzle that adds emotional weight, the generational divide. Older Australians grew up with deep respect for Queen Elizabeth. Her presence, her longevity, her aura of stability, it shaped decades of loyalty. But younger generations do not have that same emotional attachment. Their relationship with the monarchy is cultural, not emotional. Symbolic, not personal. They don't see the monarchy as an anchor. They see it as an institution that belongs to history more than the present. And that generational shift shapes policy more than politicians admit. And then you have politics. Politicians know that royal visits, especially those involving high-profile figures like Harry, bring attention. They also know that attention can become criticism, and criticism can become political damage. No government wants to be accused of funneling taxpayer money into lavish luxury for someone who is no longer a working royal. No government wants to trigger headlines implying favoritism. No government wants to be accused of bending to privilege in an era where privilege is constantly under attack. So when officials saw the request, and when they remembered the turbulence of the 2018 tour, the security complications, the backstage tension, they made a politically smart, culturally aligned, and emotionally resonant decision. They said no. But it wasn't hostility. It wasn't disrespect. It wasn't even personal. It was survival, political survival. Yet there's another twist that very few people realize unless they've followed this story deeply. Something that adds another emotional layer that influenced officials behind the scenes. The global conversation around Harry himself. Because in the years since he left the monarchy, Harry has become a lightning rod. Supporters adore him. Critics tear him apart. His name alone generates headlines. But with that attention comes unpredictability. And unpredictability is something governments despise. Whenever Harry travels, media follows. Paparazzi follows. Protests follow. Sympathizers follow. Haters follow. The risks multiply. And while Australia has handled countless royal visits, the Sussex dynamic is different. It doesn't operate within traditional royal boundaries. It exists in a hybrid space, part celebrity, part activism, part royalty, part controversy. And that hybrid space made the government uneasy. Because how do you protect someone who is both a global figure and a private citizen? How do you justify luxury arrangements for someone who is no longer there in an official capacity? How do you navigate backlash from both sides of the debate? These questions didn't just sit on the table, they weighed on the table. And then there's the emotional factor that almost no one is willing to say out loud. Australia, as a nation, prides itself on fairness, humility, equality. And the request for a fully sealed five-star suite struck some officials as being out of step with those values. Not because Harry is entitled, but because the structure around him is built on assumptions Australia no longer agrees with. In a different era, the request would have slid through. But in today's political climate, it landed like a discordant note. And here's the irony. The refusal actually aligned with what many Australians have long argued for, treating royals and non-royals equally. Not penalizing Harry, not humiliating him, but holding him to the same modernization standards they expect from everyone else.